Welcome to part 5 of the Age of Jackson. Now we're going to talk about President Jackson. Like pretty much everything else in Andrew Jackson's life, it was handled with great intensity. And so his 8 years in office are going to be surrounded with what we term as the trials of Jackson. There's 3 major things that he's going to be involved in, but there's one that deserves some mention prior to that, and that is the establishment of the spoils system. When Andrew Jackson took office, he went through in almost what was probably a fit of revenge, fired every man appointed by John Quincy Adams that he could legally fire, right? Got rid of them all and appointed people who had helped him obtain power in their place, right? Now, he said, I am firing them because they are corrupt and incompetent, and he replaced them with men who were, well, corrupt and incompetent, but they were his men, right? Andrew Jackson has introduced the spoil system, patronage, right? You reward the people that help you get into power by giving them jobs, even if they're not necessarily qualified for them. Now, the other trials that he goes through, we'll have to go through one at a time. The Nullification Crisis, which almost led to maybe it's a precursor to the Civil War. Indian removal, which is something that we'll talk about in a lot greater detail when we talk about American expansionism and imperialism. And then finally, the banking crisis, where he's going to destroy the second bank of the United States. So let's start by taking a look at the Nullification Crisis. This crisis is going to center around the Vice President of the United States, John C. Calhoun. John C. Calhoun's from South Carolina. And he is going to side with South Carolinians and other Southerners who had become resentful over the tariff laws that had been passed, right? Tariffs to protect domestic production, but also had made things like cheap cotton fabric from England more expensive. Now, if you're a Southern plantation owner, cheap cotton fabric is actually pretty important. You use it to clothe your slaves. You don't want to use that more expensive stuff that's coming out of these northern textiles, right? And so Southerners see these tariffs not as protectionism of American industry, but instead as an assault on the institution of slavery itself and an infringement of state rights over federal authority. John C. Calhoun, the vice president, is going to fall in on that line of thinking. What they don't know is where the president of the United States sits on all this. On April 13, 1830, there was a celebration of Thomas Jefferson's birthday. He'd been dead for 4 years, but they still got together and celebrated his birthday. At this gathering, Vice President Calhoun and others that supported his cause were given toast after toast after toast that were all centered around states' rights, kind of like a hint, hint, nudge, nudge, waiting for Jackson to make a toast himself. And they're all pretty certain as a Southerner and a slave owner that Jackson was going to fall in on their side of the argument as well. But when Jackson rose to give his toast, it totally shocked him. He said, "Our federal union, it must be preserved." And John C. Calhoun was crestfallen. He had come down on the side of federal authority, right? The relationship between John C. Calhoun and Andrew Jackson is going to deteriorate from there. And in fact, Jackson is going to entertain the idea of replacing him for his vice presidential candidate in the 1832 election, and Calhoun is going to resign before his term is over, right? South Carolina, meanwhile, is going to also take some action. In 1832, they are going to declare that they can nullify this law. This law is unconstitutional. These tariffs are unconstitutional, and therefore we can void it. That question again, remember, the Constitution does not say who determines constitutionality of law, and we work off of the precedent set by Marbury versus Madison that the Supreme Court determines it, but that's a precedent, right? So South Carolina is saying we can do it too, right? And if you don't like it, we'll leave. Will secede. This issue blows up to the point where Andrew Jackson is going to send a message to South Carolina asking them to please retrace their steps, and he's going to remind them separation is treason. He's going to get Congress to pass a series of force acts which will allow him to force South Carolina to pay the tariffs, and he's also going to let them know that they can try and separate if they want, but he'll go in there with the army and he will force them kicking and screaming back into the Union. As far as the crisis itself, ultimately it's solved by Henry Clay, another political rival, who's also known as the Great Compromiser. He writes a compromise bill that causes a gradual reduction in tariffs that he knows he can get South Carolina to agree to, and he also knows he can get Andrew Jackson to sign into law. The next trial of the Jackson presidency has to do with Indian removal. Right? Now, this is a complex issue, and like I said, in the topic on American imperialism, we are going to talk about this in far greater detail, especially the Cherokee Indians, because I'm going to use them as an example. Right? But in 1830, Congress passed what was called the Indian Removal Act. This was to remove all Native Americans from lands to the east of the Mississippi River to land set aside in the west, in modern-day Oklahoma and Kansas and in that region, right? The unorganized territories there, right? It's going to meet with a lot of resistance, of course, by the Native Americans. As a matter of fact, the Cherokee, which, like I said, we'll go into more detail later, will even file a lawsuit that goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And this will become part of what is known as the Marshall Trilogy on Indian removal, right? John Marshall's Supreme Court is actually going to side in favor of the Cherokees, but Andrew Jackson, being Andrew Jackson, is going to commit what is probably the largest violation of the Constitution ever in presidential history when he tells the governor of Georgia, he says, ignore that Supreme Court. Marshall has made his decision. Now let's see him enforce it. And he allows Georgia to begin removing the Cherokee anyways, along what becomes known as the Trail of Tears. Thousands of Cherokees will die on this march west of smallpox and cholera and starvation. And the Cherokee, remember, who had been allied with Jackson in the War of 1812 and had even helped him in his invasion of Florida, were now just dumbstruck by what Jackson did. They'll start referring to him as Jackson, which means Jackson the Devil. One Cherokee chief had said, who had fought along with Andrew Jackson in both Horseshoe Bend and in Florida, had said, had I known what he was going to do to my people, I would have killed him in Florida. Finally, we have the bank war. Now, as I mentioned before, Andrew Jackson hates the banks. He'd had a run-in with them back when he was a congressman, and with Jackson, everything he does is with great intensity. So he hates the banks, right? The Bank of the United States, the second Bank of the United States, has a charter that's good until 1836, which means as far as Jackson's concerned, it shouldn't matter, right? That would be the same year that Jackson would finish a second term. But unfortunately for the Bank of the United States, Nicholas Biddle, who was the president of the Second Bank of the United States, and his political ally, an adversary to Jackson, Henry Clay, had decided to try and make the Bank of the United States a political issue for the 1832 election. What did they do to do that? Well, they decided that they were going to ask for Congress to recharter the bank early to make it a political issue in 1832 instead of one in 1836. Jackson's animosity towards the bank was evident. He referred to the Second Bank of the United States as a group of expectant capitalists and a hydra of corruption. And so when he hears about this rechartering, he says, the bank is trying to kill me, but I will kill it. This is exactly what Biddle and Clay are hoping for, that Jackson will veto a rechartering of the bank to make it a political issue. And it's exactly what he does. When the recharter bank hits his desk, he vetoes it. He says it is unauthorized by the Constitution, subversive to the rights of states, and dangerous to the liberties of the people. And then he goes on to make a statement that completely caused this entire ploy by Clay and Biddle to backfire on him. He says, it is to be regretted that the rich and the powerful too often bend the acts of government to their selfish purposes. There are no necessary evils in government. Its evils exist only in its abuses. If it would confine itself to equal protection, and as the heaven does its rain showers its favor alike on the high and the low, the rich and the poor, it would be an unqualified blessing. He framed this argument in the shape that he's doing this for the people, and the people love it. He easily gets reelected in 1832. The bank, he destroys it by removing all deposits from the bank, right? And by 1836, when the charter finally runs out, the Bank of the United States disappears. This, in turn, is an economic disaster in the United States. Jackson's destruction of the Second Bank of the United States caused the United States to lose any rational pattern of the American economy, right? It plunged the United States into a deep, long depression. And finally, it allowed Wall Street to take over the money markets in the United States, right? They became the rationale center of the economy. It's something that they're going to dominate into and even through the Great Depression. It's not going to be really until the New Deal and the beginning of the regulation of the stock exchange that you're really going to see Wall Street, which still holds a lot of power today, start to be reined in a little.